Congratulations to you all on this anniversary. 80. Wow. I was born 80 years ago, so that must be very significant. Yes, I am talking to you from my home in Holyhead in North Wales. You might not know where it is. It's in the very centre of the British Isles. And I would normally, in a lecture, begin by saying good morning if it was morning, or good afternoon if it was afternoon, but I have no idea what time you are all on. 1,000 people out there, but where are they? And what time of day is it? This is one of the amazing changes that has taken place. Before BC, before COVID, it was always face-to-face, wasn't it? It was always, I was physically present with people. Therefore, I knew what time of day it was, but now I don't anymore. And I'll talk in a little while about the implications for language of this remarkable new technological situation that is illustrated by the fact that I am with you virtually, but not physically, which is a shame because it would be lovely to be in your wonderful country. But off we go with this topic of what's new in the English language. And why have I addressed this topic? Well, it was all to do with the encyclopedia that you mentioned, Matthew. The English Language Encyclopedia, this heavy thing. Gosh, I can hardly carry it now. It's getting heavier and heavier. The point is that this is the third edition of this book. The first edition came out in 1997, I think it was. And the second edition came out in 2003, and the third edition just a couple of years ago. And you know, when one is writing a new edition of a book, you don't expect to have to do very much. You know, a few pages extra, perhaps, a few bits of changing around of subject matter, a bit of updating and that sort of thing. Well, when I took the second edition of the book down and started to go through it, I had no idea just how much I needed to change. And in fact, the third edition has 50 new pages, which was a complete shock to me, really. And so what I wanted to do today was bring you up to date on which areas of study in the English language required that new amount of material. And this illustrates very well, I think, the main trends that have taken place in the study of English and in the English language as a whole over the past 10 or 15 years. So important for those of you out there who are teachers of English to keep up to speed with what's going on in the language. And it's not easy. Gosh, I have the difficult job. No, you have the difficult job. Those of you who teach English are tremendously, or translate and interpret into English, a very difficult job. Me as a linguist, it's so easy. I just have to sit here in my study and observe the language and write down what's going on and put it in a book. The actual task of teaching the thing in a classroom, oh gosh, I admire all of you who do that. So where did these 50 pages come from? What was involved in them? And I'm going to talk mainly about three big areas. I'm going to talk about the status of English as a global language. Then I'm going to talk about the implications of that, and especially the cultural implications of that. And then I'm going to talk about the digital revolution, which has caused so much change. And then, well, I mustn't forget Shakespeare. I'm going to mention Shakespeare towards the end, because even Shakespeare has been affected by what's been going on in English over the past 15 years. I know he's been dead for 400 years, but we're still doing things to him that he would never have imagined. So to begin with the question of English as a global language, you've already mentioned, sirs, it is. And you've mentioned the way in which it is so important as an international and global language. But the question that people still ask a lot of the time is, just how global is English? Just how many people do use English around the world? And this is where those 3 editions of the book are so interesting to me, because they give different totals as time goes by. When the first edition of the English language encyclopedia came out in 1997, what I did was I went through all the countries in the world and tried to find out how many people speak English in those countries. Now, that isn't easy. Nobody knows for sure, because no country keeps accurate statistics on the number of people who use a language. And remember, by use, those of you who are teachers know this very well, I mean not just speaking the language, but understanding it and reading it and writing it. The 4 dimensions of language use: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You know the situation. There are languages that you can listen to and understand, but you don't speak them. Or there are languages that you can read quite well, but you can't write them. So a figure for using English is inevitably going to be somewhat approximate, somewhat vague. So what I did was I asked the people who know. I would ask the members of the British Council in the different parts of the world, the people who look after examinations. How many people are taking examinations in English at the moment, I would ask. I would go to other institutions that deal with language and ask them. I would ask individuals, like I might ask you, how many people use English in Thailand? And your answer will be, I've no idea. I mean, I can give you a rough idea. And if I ask enough people, a consensus will emerge, a percentage will emerge. And so I would take all this information into account, synthesize it, and come up with a figure. Very approximate. And then do this for all the countries in the world. It took a while, let me tell you. It took a month to do all this. But the result was 1.5 billion, 1,500 million people using English in some way or another around the world in 1997. Of those 1,500 million, just 400 million were native speakers of English, first language speakers of English, English as a mother tongue, or father tongue, if you prefer me not to be too sexist about this, or parent tongue, if you want me to avoid male and female altogether. 1.5 billion, 400 million. In other words, for every 1 native speaker of the language, there were 4 non-native speakers of the language. In other words, the center of gravity of the language had shifted from the native speaker to the non-native speaker. And that is the pattern we have seen ever since. So for the second edition in 2003, I did the same exercise all over again. And what do you think I found? Well, there was an increase. Yes, indeed. The total for 6 years later was 2 billion, 2,000 million in 6 years. That was the peak of growth in English language use around the world, it seems. And by the way, just in case you think it's just me talking, no, there were others who were doing a similar sort of thing. I don't know whether you've ever seen the report by a scholar called David Gradol. He was doing a similar kind of exercise at that time, and he too came up with the figure of roughly 2 billion users around the world. The number of native speakers stayed the same, 400 million, more or less. It was the non-native speakers where the increase lay. And so for the third edition, just a couple of years ago, I did the same exercise once again. And what figure did I come up with this time? Well. 2.3 billion. 2.3. Now, that shows two things. First of all, English is continuing to grow in numbers of users. But the second thing, not at the same rate as it was doing before. You see, between 1997 and 2003, 500 million people apparently began to use English more than before. If that rate had continued over the subsequent 15 years, we would expect now there to be over 3 billion people using English around the world. And they're not. The figure is, remember, 2.3 billion. So this rate of increase in English seems to have flattened a little bit. Still increasing, but not as rapidly as it was before. Why is this? And you know, I have no idea. I can think of all sorts of ideas, but I don't know which is the right one. Maybe the number of people who need to use English in the world has reached its peak. Maybe not everybody in the world needs to know English. 7 billion people in the world, why should they all learn English? No reason. Maybe we are reaching a climax here. Or maybe it's something to do with technology. With all the translation technology available now, maybe people are no longer feeling the need to learn a foreign language to the same extent as they used to. And I'm sure you can think of other reasons why English might be reaching a plateau, but it is still increasing. However, the number of native speakers is not increasing. It is still second language learners, foreign language learners, that are causing this continuing increase in the numbers of English users. Still round about 400 million of people who live in Britain, Ireland, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the countries of the Caribbean, and a sprinkling of other territories, South Africa, and so on around the world. 400 million, more or less. Well, in 1997, there was one native speaker for every 4 non-native speakers. Now, it's one native speaker for every, well, you do the mathematics, 6 or 7 non-native speakers. The center of gravity has definitely shifted away from the native speaker to the non-native speaker. Putting this another way, who owns English? Who are the owners of English? Once upon a time, it was easy to say the British were. And then probably after a while, the Americans were. And now you own the language. All of you. All those, the vast majority who use English, you own it. You have a right in it. This is a difficult concept to get on board for many people. They think, oh dear, if I do not use English in exactly the way that the British do or the Americans do, then something is wrong with my English. No, not anymore. The British are a tiny minority of English language users around the world. Even the Americans, with 250 or so million speakers of English, it's a small dialect of English around the world. There are probably more people speaking English in India and in China than in the United States now. And so the consequences have to be taken on board by all of us. Yes, it is the case that if you start a language, the language began in the British Isles, yes, there is a kind of sense of priority, I suppose, or a respect for history or something like that. But when you look at the state of affairs around the world now, what we see is a proliferation of dialects, a proliferation of what is often called new Englishes, new Englishes. That plural takes people by surprise sometimes. I once went and talked about this subject at a hotel somewhere in the south of Europe, and the manager of the hotel had announced my talk, and it was called The Future of Englishes. But on the notice board in the foyer of the hotel, he put up The Future of English. And I said to him, no, the talk is Englishes. And he looked at me and said, there is no such word in English. English has no plural. It is English. It has got to be English. I said, no. English has a plural now. And so they went and found an E and an S and put it up on the hotel notice board, and I was very happy. Englishes, yes. New varieties of English, new dialects of English. This is the consequence of English becoming a global language. In a way, this shouldn't surprise anybody. A language always develops dialects. Within Britain, as soon as the invaders from Europe arrived in the 5th century AD, people from different parts of Europe speaking different Germanic dialects. From the very beginning, there were dialects in Britain. And we know this for a fact because when the language first started to be written down, you could see these dialect differences in the spellings that were being used. And since then, the number of dialects in Britain has increased enormously. And by dialect, I mean differences of grammar, differences of vocabulary, differences in pronunciation too, differences of accent. Do you know there is an accent shift? In other words, a different type of pronunciation on average in Britain every 25 miles or so. It's amazing, really. If I travel 25 miles down the road here to another part of Wales, I will hear English spoken in a noticeably different kind of way. On average, notice. In some parts of the country, it's nearer. In others, it's further away, on average. That's amazing. But other countries too have their dialect and accent differences. Maybe not so dramatic as in Britain, in a small country where these differences are so noticeable. But no, if you go to the United States and Canada and Australia and so on, you will again find dialect and accent differences, though over a much broader stretch of territory. So it's a perfectly normal thing for a language to develop new accents and new dialects, and to be proud of them. To be proud of them. Oh yes, there is a standard British English. You know it very well. Many of you will have taught it. Standard British English, and probably the accent going with that, received pronunciation, the accent of the BBC, the accent of the Queen, and so on, the prestige accent that developed in the south of England around 1800 or so. But the other accents and dialects of the country are also respected. So if you go up to Yorkshire, for example, they are so proud of the way they speak in Yorkshire with their local accent and their local dialect. And if you dare try to be dismissive of it or to criticize it, you might never get out of Yorkshire alive. And it's the same all over the country. There are still some people around who criticize accents and dismiss them and consider them to be rubbish, but these are a tiny minority. People are proud of the way they speak. Now, take that way of looking at things and transfer it to the global situation. What has happened since the 1970s is a dramatic increase in the number of international dialects of English around the world. Why the 1970s? Well, it's always a political issue, isn't it? Always a cultural issue. A language doesn't just change. A language changes because people make it change. And they make it change because of a situation that has evolved, a political situation, a social situation. So what was the big change in the middle of the 20th century? It was the growth of the United Nations and the move towards independence of dozens of countries around the world, away from the colonial history that so many of them were part of. So in the 1960s and 70s, we saw country after country after country becoming independent. Now, I put it to you, here's a thought experiment for you. What is going to happen once you become independent in relation to language? Imagine you are in charge in a country like Nigeria in Africa. You are in charge and your country has just become independent. What will you do? And all over the world, people thought in this way. We have a new flag now. We have a new set of institutions. Linguistically, what shall we do? And all over the world, people thought, let's get rid of our colonial history. Let us drop English because it is a marker of a time we want to forget. Let us have a local language, an indigenous language, as our national language now. And that's understandable, isn't it? But remember, you are in charge in Nigeria. You look around you and say, which language shall we have as our national language? You discover, or you recognize, that there were over 400 languages in Nigeria at the time. Which one will you choose? and you suddenly realize that you can't choose. Choose this one and they will not like it. Choose that one and they will not like it. You can't choose. And so, again, over the world, people thought like this: we had better stay with English then. Do you know the proverbial expression, better the devil you know? Better the devil you know. At least everybody dislikes English equally. And so they did stay with English. But, and here is the magical thing, they then decided to make it their English. Change the English. No longer British English, no longer American English in the case of Liberia, for example. Let us make it our English. Let us make it Nigerian English. That is how we will show our identity, our difference from the past. And all over the world, that is what happened. And I know this for a fact. Why? Because I was there. I know from my youthful appearance, you cannot believe this. But in fact, in the 1960s, I was at the University of Reading, as you mentioned earlier, and started a project with a colleague called A Dictionary of English-Speaking Peoples. And remember, 1960s, late 1960s, the independence movements were growing around the world. We wrote to the universities in all these places and asked them, are you changing the language? What are you doing? And they all wrote back and said, of course we are. And they sent me examples of the sorts of things that were happening, especially in vocabulary. So what they did was they looked around their country and began to collect all the words in that country that identify that country. So think about it. If we were to do this in Thailand, all the local plants and animals of your country, all the myths and legends of your country, all the folklore of the country, the politics of the country, all the different movements that are there, the literature of the country. So as soon as you start to think about it, you think there must be hundreds, thousands of words and expressions that identify our culture. And that is the critical word. The cultural manifestation in language that expresses the identity of a nation. This is what people were collecting. And there were hundreds of examples coming through. So many, in fact, that we weren't able to publish that dictionary. It would have been too big. No publisher could manage it. And even today, there is no such thing as an international dictionary of cultural language. But that is what happened. Suddenly, individual countries began to identify themselves by the distinctive, vocabulary mainly, grammar to some extent, and pronunciation also to some extent, but vocabulary mainly. And don't underestimate the scale of this. Over here on my shelves, I've got a pile of dictionaries, a dictionary of South African English. It has 10,000 distinctive words and phrases from South Africa in that. Words that are used only in South Africa, in English, mind, or just around, which I would not know because I'm not South African. Over here, oh, look at this one. Look at this big fat thing. Can you see the title? I'll read it for you. Dictionary of the English and English Creole of Trinidad and Tobago. Those tiny little islands in the Caribbean. And somebody, this wonderful person, Lise Weiner, has collected all the vocabulary that is distinctive to those islands. There are 15,000 words and phrases in there. It's amazing. The scale of it is amazing. I'm not surprised at the fact that Trinidad has developed this vocabulary, or South Africa or anywhere, but it's the scale of it that's so important. And you see, the thing is this, that these are expressions in English in these countries. Now, I am a native speaker of English. I have Welsh as my second language, but my first language is English. So I think I know the English language. I go to South Africa and I suddenly realize I do not know the English language, or at least I don't know it in its South African manifestation. Here's an example of what I mean. We were driving along a road in South Africa, British Council car, British Council driver, and me sitting next. And I see a sign on the side of the road, and it said, "Robot ahead." Robot ahead. And I turn to the driver and I say, what's a robot? Have they landed? What is happening? He was so surprised, amazed. He could hardly keep the car on the road. He said, "You don't know what a robot is?" I said, "Yes, a robot is a machine that does things." No, he says, "You don't know what a robot is here." I said, "No." He had to explain. Do you know what it is? A robot is a traffic light in South Africa. That's all, a traffic light. And in South African English, they say things like, "Turn left at the robot." "The robot is broken." "The robot is red." Of course, once you know, you know. I had no trouble with robot after that, but remember, there are another 10,000 words and expressions in South African English that I do not yet know. Do I need to know? Well, no. Unless I go to live in South Africa or develop a particular interest in South Africa, I do not need to know all these things. But I do need to know some. And you must have had this experience. Those of you who are travelers, again, BC, before COVID. But the world is opening up again now, thank goodness, and people are beginning to travel. So this experience will once again be part of many people. You go into a restaurant in some foreign city and you say, "Can I have the English menu?" And they give you a menu and you start to read it and you go, "Sorry, I want the English menu." And they say, "That is the English menu." And the reason you have a problem is because all the different kinds of food that are on the menu are local foods that you can't translate into another kind of English. They are English, but they are foreign words in English. They are loan words, as they say, into English. And this kind of experience is just so common. Now, here's the implication, you see, for those of you who are teachers of English. Once upon a time, it was a fairly straightforward situation, wasn't it? There was British English and there was American English. And there we were. And probably you taught your students some of the differences between British and American English. The different parts of a motor car, for instance. The front part is the bonnet in British English and the hood in American English. Or the boot at the back of the car is a trunk in American English. So probably you taught some of these things. There weren't that many differences of a common kind. If you add up all the differences between a British English dictionary and an American English dictionary, you'll only find a few hundred common expressions. And you can spread these out over your teaching course so that the students will gradually come to be familiar with British English and American English. But you see, these days, especially because of the internet, we encounter not only British English and American English, we are now increasingly encountering these other kinds of English. Go to a chat room and remember that we're talking now about our students, not just the older section of the community. No, not people like me. No, I'm talking about my children and my grandchildren. And they are encountering a very different world as far as exposure to English is concerned. They go into chat rooms and social media and all the other areas where English is being used. And remember, most people in these domains are anonymous. So you have no idea where they come from, but they are using the English they know. And so increasingly we encounter these new kinds of English, this new vocabulary online, even if you've never been to the country. You will encounter South African English and Indian English and all the other kinds of English that exist out there to some degree or other online. Now, I said before, I'm a native speaker of English, but I still find myself lost when I go to a country, wrong tense, when I used to go to a country, BC, and talk to groups of people there in English, talk to groups of teachers in English, especially because very often it would be a teaching conference I would attend. And everybody would be chatting away quite happily. And suddenly I would realize that I did not understand what they were saying. Not because of any failure in pronunciation or failure in grammar. No, no. I was talking to people who were fluent in English. Nothing wrong with their grammar, nothing wrong with their pronunciation, nothing wrong with their vocabulary even, except that I did not understand the cultural background to the vocabulary that they were using. Now, let me give you an example of this so that you can see what I'm saying here when I talk about culture and language. You talk to me and you notice my watch here. And you say to me, "That's a nice watch." And I say to you, no, it's not Bond Street. And leave it like that and pass on to talk about something else. And you say to yourself, what did he say? What? You're not going to be so rude as to say, "Excuse me, David, stop a moment. What did you mean by the sentence you just said?" No. Most people will just say, "Oh, it's not Bond Street." Oh, well, okay, whatever that means. It's not very important anyway. What do I mean by saying it's not Bond Street? Well, do you know your London culture? If you know the streets of London, you will know that Bond Street, near Oxford Street, in the center of London, is the most expensive street in London. Therefore, what I am saying is, this is not an expensive watch. It's a very cheap watch, is what I'm saying. Now, that's the sort of thing I mean by culture entering into a language, a conversation, and becoming opaque, becoming difficult to understand. Not because you didn't understand the word watch, you knew that, but you didn't understand the implications of Bond Street. Now, let me turn this around. I come to Bangkok, and you say to me, I say, that's a nice watch. And you say, oh, but it's not. And then you refer to the most expensive street in Bangkok. I have no idea what you're talking about because I do not know what that expensive street is. And that is the problem that we encounter over and over and over in the modern world when we encounter English around the world. Increasingly, we encounter cultural illusions which people from outside the culture do not understand, and they are too polite to ask or to stop the conversation and say, sorry, what does that mean that you just said? We're talking about the political situation, especially. Politics, everybody talks about politics at some point or another. So you come to this country, to Britain, and you hear people talking about Boris. Everybody knows who Boris is. It's the name of our Prime Minister. If you don't know that, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I now go to your country, and I expect you have names or nicknames for your senior politicians as well. But I do not know what they are. You might drop them into the conversation, and I'm too polite to say, sorry, tell me, what are you talking about? We just let the conversation continue. But sometimes it could be important. Sometimes a reference of that kind is important. It could affect me. You come to Britain and you say, I'm going to drive down to Cornwall because that is a nice part of the country. And I might say to you, oh, you don't want to go on the A303. What is the A303? And the answer is, it's a road that goes to Cornwall, but it's famous for its traffic jams, especially as it passes Stonehenge, the ancient monument. Again, in this case, it could cause you hours of delay. So it's good to know. I remember in my lifetime now, the many occasions when I have been fooled by speakers of English, not knowing what to say. My very first visit to America, that stays in my mind. It's back in the 60s, my first visit to America. So what am I? Where am I? I go into a cafe, a diner, and I stand in a queue. I stand in a line, and I get to the front of the line, and the guy in the diner says, what do you want? And I said, I'd like some eggs. And he said to me, how do you like your eggs? And, I did not know what to reply, because that was not a British question. People on the whole at that time in Britain did not ask you that question. So I did not know what to say. I simply said, cooked. And the guy looked at me and said, what do you mean, cooked? Of course they're cooked. Do you want them? And then he rattled off at me all the terminology of American eggs. Do you want them once over lightly? Do you want them sunny side up? And I learned all this. This was new to me. I'd never heard these expressions before. I know them now. And probably all you do as well, thanks to American films and television and all of that. But at the time, I did not know. There are still things I do not know that Americans sometimes use in conversation with me. One happened not so long ago. I was in a little conference, and the American speaker was asking for questions. And somebody asked a question, and he said, "That was from out of left field." And the person next to me from abroad said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I don't know. I know now." Because I asked him, I said, "Excuse me, what does out of left field mean?" And the American guy couldn't believe his ears. "You mean you don't know baseball?" "No, I don't know baseball. I've no idea what baseball is all about." Oh, he explained, from out of left field is when the ball comes from an unexpected direction. By out of left field, I mean, that was an unexpected question. Oh, I learned then something about baseball. "You played that with a straight bat," I said, referring to cricket. And the American guy said, "What do you mean?" You see, he didn't understand cricket. I didn't understand baseball. That is the kind of thing that can come up in a conversation. So what I'm saying is that cultural differences have become hugely important, increasingly important in language over the past, well, generation or so, past 30, 40 years. And these are differences that our students learning English are likely to encounter, some of them anyway. So it is so important that one builds into one's teaching course, can I call it a cultural dimension? Maybe you already do this, perhaps with a British and American English, but now make it global English. This is how the British say it, that you've just been learning. We've been talking about the present tense and how you say it in English with this basic vocabulary. And this is how the British say it, but this is how the Americans say it. Mention it at the same time. If you don't, what will happen is that the students will go home and start going on the internet or watching American films, and will come back the next day and said, "Teacher, you said that this was the case, but I just heard it differently. What's going on?" So you can avoid all that problem by anticipating it. Basic words. In Britain, we talk about a pavement at the side of the road. In America, they talk about a sidewalk. And in Australia, they talk about a footpath. So you see, increasingly, we might encounter these little words, build them into the course, not all at once, no, slowly over time, so that the students become students of global English, not just British English, not just American English, but global English. They develop a global awareness of the language. And this also applies to accent. And this is such an important thing. How many of you out there are worried about your English accent? You say to yourself, "Oh, I don't speak English very well. My accent is not very British." My answer to you is, why should your accent be British? You're from Thailand, for heaven's sake. I want your accent to sound Thai. I don't want your accent to sound British. I don't want your accent to sound American, unless you're from America. Sure, you can have your Thai accent with a bit of British as well, or with a British American or what have you, but don't be afraid of your local accent, as long as it is intelligible. That's the point. Yes, if it's unintelligible, then of course you need to do some work. But most people around the world who speak English have a distinctive local accent. And I love that. I love it when I hear French speakers speaking English in a French accent, or Germans in a German accent, or Thai people in a Thai accent. It's wonderful. My analogy, I go into a garden and all the flowers in the garden are the same. What a boring garden that is. I go into a linguistic garden, the Englishes of the world. And if everybody spoke it in the same accent, what a boring world that would be. No, accents are the flowers of language. And the more flowers that there are, the better, it seems to me. So intelligibility indeed, but don't be scared of accent identity. That's the point. And if somebody says, perhaps a more traditional conservative teacher says, oh, but I learned my English in Britain from the Queen or whoever, you see, and they're proud of their traditional British accent. Well, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But don't expect everybody else to be the same. You might be thinking, well, I learned my English from the BBC, and I have this lovely received pronunciation. Here's David Crystal talking to us. You see, listen to his accent. But hang on a moment. I don't speak received pronunciation. I don't speak received pronunciation. I could adopt the accent of the BBC or the accent of the Queen, or try to, but it's not my natural accent. No, my accent is the accent I'm using now, and this is the accent which in my background is a mixture of Wales and Liverpool, where I lived for 10 years. It's a very different accent from the accent of the south of England. I say Bath, not Bath. I say example, not example. So is my accent wrong? No, of course not. It's just different. And you are the same. So long as it's an intelligible accent, be proud of the identity that lies behind it. Now, throughout all this talk, I've been repeatedly referring to the internet. And this is the third big area that I wanted to mention before we stop for some questions and discussion. Yes, the internet has changed a lot, hasn't it? Indeed, especially for younger people. One has to get into the mindset of one's young students. For me, books are central and the screen is marginal. For young people, the screen is central and books are marginal. So one has to take into account the kind of English these people, our young students, and not so young students now, will encounter on the internet. It is a different world. How different? How different is the language of the internet from traditional pre-internet language? People talk about a revolution in the internet. Well, actually, you know, the differences are not as great as you might think. If you compare a website with a text that was there before the internet came along, you don't notice that many differences. On the whole, the vocabulary and the grammar and the orthography of the internet is the same as it was before. Now, you have to be precise about this. What do I mean? The vocabulary of the internet is the same. Well, let's look at it. I haven't got time today to go into all the ramifications, but a few years ago I did, for a little book I wrote called A Glossary of Text Speak and Net Speak. I spent a whole week collecting all the new words that had come into English on the internet. Words, of course, from computing, like mouse and menu, but also words to do with social media, like blog and blogging and blogger, and the blogosphere of people who blog, or the bloguverse, the universe of people who blog, all that sort of terminology. And I added it all up and I got a figure of about 2,000. And if I did it today, it would be bigger because of things like Twitter and so on, which have added to the vocabulary. It's probably twice as much now. And you think that's a lot? No, it isn't. 2,000 or 5,000 new words and idioms is not a lot. There are over 1 million words in English. At least that. Nobody knows how many. An extra 2,000 or 3,000 is a big deal? No. We're talking 1%, if that, of vocabulary affected by the internet. What about grammar? Are there any new grammatical constructions that have come into the English language as a result of the internet? I cannot think of one. No. There are new styles on the internet. Short sentences, for instance, on Twitter or on other kinds of social media or in text messaging, but not new grammatical constructions. None. What about orthography, the other big area of the internet? Because for most of us, the internet is still a typing medium. One day it'll be oral and aural more than anything else, but not at the moment. So has the orthography changed? What do I mean by orthography? I mean spelling, punctuation, capitalization. And here you say immediately, oh yes, there have been lots of changes here. And indeed, there have been changes in orthography. You all use emails. In an English email, if you're writing very carefully, you will maintain your spelling and your punctuation and your capital letters. But I get dozens of emails every day which don't use punctuation at all, or hardly any, or no capital letters, or even the spellings are not corrected. And I understand why. And I don't write back to my correspondent and say, hey, you left a full stop out there. Hey, you should have had a capital letter in there. No, I accept email as a new kind of style, if you like. And the same thing applies to short messaging services like WhatsApp, where again, people have developed a different kind of orthography. Sometimes it is minimalist, by which I mean they leave punctuation out. Sometimes it is the opposite, maximalist, where they put extra punctuation in. You must have encountered that. You get a message saying, fantastic! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation. The person keeps the finger on the exclamation mark key. I have had emails with 20 exclamation marks in. That has never happened in the history of English before, or other languages, but it's happening now. But this is still a small part of orthography. On the whole, the language you see on the internet is not so different from what happened before. But in one crucial respect, there is a very important difference, and that is in the area of interaction, conversational interaction, talking to each other, like I am doing to you now. This is very strange. This is so different. Once upon a time, BC, before COVID, this kind of interaction, me talking to you on Zoom, was really rather unusual. and most people never did it. Now it is routine. And as a result, we have to cope with the pressures that come from using this new technology. What sort of pressures? Well, the pressure on conversation, for a start. You will all have experienced this. I have no doubt if you have used things like Zoom or the other platforms. You are talking to other people. They can be your friends. They can be your family, your children, your parents. And you're trying to have a conversation like I'm having with you now. And in a few moments, as we have questions and answers, it will become more conversation-like. But it's not like a normal conversation, is it? Why? Because it lacks the crucial feature of a successful conversation. The two people talking, this one doing all the talking, this one listening, but at the same time saying things like, yeah, sure, really? Oh no, wow, good heavens. In other words, the listener keeps up a commentary, feeding back into the conversation so that the speaker knows that the listener is happy with what is happening, happy with what is going on. Now, this simultaneous feedback is crucial to the success of a conversation. Without it, the conversation cannot continue. And that is the big difference with Zoom conversations. Because in Zoom conversations, the listeners do not give simultaneous feedback. I am talking to you now. I have no idea whether you are enjoying my talk, whether you are disliking it, whether you have fallen asleep, whether you have taken notes. I have no idea because I cannot see you. And even if I could see you, you would not be giving me these reinforcing remarks which enable me to know that I'm doing a good job. You are silent out there. I am on my own. And this is true for anybody who is using Zoom or any other similar platform. So at the end of a Zoom conversation, have you not felt this? You feel a bit tired. You feel a bit exhausted because the responsibility has been on you and you want to know how other people have felt and you don't know. And this is tiring. And so that is the big difference, the big change that has taken place in language. We have to make our language more self-contained, more autonomous. We have to make it more complete in a way, slightly more formal than it otherwise would be. We don't use all the little colloquialisms that we use in everyday conversation. Colloquialisms like, you know, you see, mind you, and all of this, they don't turn up in a conversation online. So it is a very different kind of thing. So there we are. I'm nearly at the end of my hour. In fact, I've just slightly overrun it, according to my cheap, not Bond Street watch. And I did promise you a reference to Shakespeare, which I will do before I end. Dear old Shakespeare, we have been studying him for 400 years. Well, 300 anyway. Next year, to 2023, is the 400th anniversary of the publication of the first folio of his plays, where for the first time all his plays were published. And when we look at the language of Shakespeare, if you've studied Shakespeare, maybe you felt that his language is difficult because so much of the vocabulary is unfamiliar. And people used to say that he invented so many new words in English that were never there before. People would say thousands of new words have come into English because of Shakespeare. Well, we've now learned, thanks to the internet, that this is not the case. Shakespeare wasn't as inventive in his vocabulary as people thought. Oh yes, there are lots of wonderful words that Shakespeare did introduce, but we're talking only a few hundred, not a few thousand. How do we know? Thanks once again to the internet, because the internet has now made available to us all the plays and prose works of Shakespeare's time that before we would never be able to see, unless apart from going to a big library like the British Library and doing hours of research there. No, they're all online now. So people who used to say Shakespeare invented this word, the answer is no, he didn't, because we've seen it in an earlier writer. What Shakespeare did was popularize this word, make it more available than it was before by putting it into one of his wonderful plays. And so even Shakespeare, you see, has been affected by the revolution in language study that has come partly as a result of the internet and partly as a result of our greater sophistication in using this new technology. So there we are, that's the formal part of my talk. Just to recapitulate, I began by talking about the way in which English has continued to increase around the world, but not as rapidly as it did before. I talked about then the cultural implications of that, with every one of these new Englishes developing varieties of the language that are distinctive to their own community and varieties which they are increasingly proud of, especially, you remember, in relation to accent. And so much of this new availability is a result of the internet. And when we start to study the language of the internet, we find a mixed response. Some parts of the internet haven't changed at all. Other parts, such as Zoom conversations, have changed quite dramatically. And it's affected all of us, not just living now, but living once upon a time, even remember dear old Shakespeare. So thank you for that. Thank you for listening. I hope you have been wherever you are. And there is now a chance, thanks to our moderator, to have a bit of discussion, a few questions perhaps, a few other points. Thank you, everybody. Move on to the next part. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you so very much, Dr. Crystal. And indeed, we saved a fair amount of time for questions. And to the audience and people who are online, you may raise your hand online, or you can write out a question in the chat box. We're watching, monitoring both the chat box as well as we're looking for raised hands. And as I said, we have saved a fair amount of time. We'll go until we run out of energy or until the questions expire. There's Ajan Onuma, please.
Do I just talk or?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Crystal. I just want to say that I read your book and I really loved it.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I think the major one I want to ask you is that you were saying how some parts of the internet have stayed true to sort of the language that we've been taught or that we're teaching our students in classrooms. So as an instructor, that's something I want to ask. But I have questions like, for example, like you were saying, things like orthography haven't changed. But then I see, for example, on social media, the use of, instead of like a full stop, they'll use like an emoji or a GIF or a meme or something to reply to people. How do we address that in our classrooms to sort of help our students to interact in the spaces they want to interact with? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really important question. Yes, the first thing, of course, is the descriptive task, to be aware of what the changes have been. And that's my job, and the job of others who are studying language of the internet. And there are several books out there now, as you probably know, which do try to identify what these changes are. First thing then is to recognize what the changes are. And the best way of doing this, even if you haven't read the books, is to look at what the students are doing. And one of the things that they're doing is they are taking some traditional features of punctuation and changing their use. And this is really interesting and very different from our traditional understanding of things like punctuation. So take the full stop case that you mentioned. Why do we use full stops? Periods, as Americans say. Why do we use them? Now, when you were in school, once upon a time, like I was when I was that big, the teacher would tell me, David, you must use a full stop at the end of a statement. You must put it in. If I got it wrong, smack. Naughty. Full stops at the end of a statement, question marks at the end of a question, exclamation marks at the end, and so on. Full stops. Why full stops? Why? To show that the sentence has come to an end. And secondly, to separate sentences, to show that they don't run together. They are the two reasons for using a full stop after a statement, to show that the sentence has come to an end, to separate sentences. Once students realize this, then it's understandable what is happening on the internet. So let's take WhatsApp as a case in point. Here we have a short messaging service. The screen is that big. A statement emerges on WhatsApp. It's going to be short. Nobody uses very long sentences on WhatsApp. They don't need to. They don't want to. So the sentence is short. Do you therefore need a full stop at the end if it is a statement? And apparently, the users of this medium think, no. Why should I? You can tell the statement has come to an end because there is the edge of the screen. It's obvious, or the color of the box in which the sentence is used. I don't need a full stop to separate sentences because I'm not putting up a string of sentences on the internet on my WhatsApp phone. I'm talking one sentence at a time. So I don't need full stops. And that seems to be what happened, not just on WhatsApp, but in several other areas as well. In text messaging, for example, people decided not to use full stops. They felt they weren't necessary. It saves a keystroke. And anything that saves a keystroke is a good thing, you see. Well, if it had stayed like that, no problem. But then the amazing thing happened. And this is probably what you're thinking about, Leon. Because it's now normal not to use full stops, if you put one in, it means something. It means something. And this is where this concept of a full stop carrying an emotional charge has emerged. Let me give you an example. You write to me and say, Johnny's coming to the party this evening. Now, if you just write it like that, without a full stop at the end, it means Johnny's coming to the party this evening. But if you write it like this, Johnny's coming to the party this evening, full stop. For so many people, it means, oh dear, Johnny's coming to the party. Oh, I wish he wasn't. Oh gosh, there's something about Johnny that you need to know. Some sort of meaning, some sort of extra charge comes with that full stop. And this is something that young people have developed without being taught. And now not so young people. I do it. Not perhaps so much with reference to an example like the one I've just used, but if I'm having an interaction with somebody in text messaging or on WhatsApp or whatever it is, I don't put full stops in after statements. And if I do put one in, especially as I want the conversation to end, I often put a full stop in to, as it were, signal, right, I'm finishing this conversation now. Yeah. And the other person recognizes this and says, okay, nice talking to you, and off we go. So slowly, even my age is being affected by this new style. Now, it's not just full stops, because similar things are happening to some other punctuation marks as well, like ... But it is a very nice indication of the way in which on the internet, in small ways, only small ways, remember, most of the punctuation marks are still being used in a similar sort of way, question marks, for instance. But in small ways, you're right, these things are coming in the direction of emojis and things like that, where the actual symbol on the screen is carrying a certain kind of meaning. Very interesting development. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. Thank you.
We have a couple questions that have been given to us in the chat box. Here's one. How should we prepare our students, or younger generation generally, or even parents and teachers for this culturally diverse future of global English?
Well, now, this is what I meant earlier on when I said, you have the difficult job, you guys out there. Linguists like me have an easy job, just identifying these things. You have to teach it. How? Well, I'm not a teacher. I'm not an English language teacher. I don't work in classrooms like you do. But I have been into many classrooms and observed what teachers who are trying to do this have been doing. Thanks to organizations like IATEFL, the teaching organization. And this is what I see. The most successful cases do this. First of all, nothing that I've said in my talk affects production. You know that tradition between production and comprehension. In production, you will carry on teaching whatever it is you know how to teach. If you're used to teaching British English and receive pronunciation, then you will carry on like that. Because after all, this is a widely used accent and dialect. It may be the one you learned yourself. It may be the one that is in your textbooks. It may be the one that the examiners will expect your students to know. So for all these reasons, you will carry on teaching production in the same way as you always used to. But when it comes to comprehension, then things certainly have changed. And by comprehension, I mean both listening comprehension and reading comprehension. And what I notice is this, that the teachers who are most into this global cultural phenomenon, they have begun to introduce cultural variation into their classrooms right from the very beginning, not leaving it to an advanced stage. Some people think like this: I will teach my students English and then I will later add cultural variation to what they already know. That doesn't seem to work well. And the reason is because the students have you as their teacher for what? 1 hour a day, 2 or 3 hours a week, whatever it is. Outside the classroom, they are encountering English online, in films, in television. And so they are already encountering the cultural variation that they don't get in the classroom. So the best teachers, in my view, are those who take some time to find out what the students are actually experiencing in their day-to-day lives in the English language, by finding out what pop music they listen to, what films and television they watch, what video games they watch, all of these things, what social media they go onto. Spend some time discussing with the students what these things are. What are their favorite pop music celebrities, and so on. And then they can talk about these things in their own language, in Thai or whatever language it is. But in talking English, as I say, the best teachers start to introduce some of this local vocabulary, this cultural vocabulary, many proper names as well, of course, into their classrooms right from the very beginning. Drip, 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 a tiny bit. In their very first, I remember watching a class, the very first one, lesson 1, basic questions like, hello, how are you? And things like this. And starting to, most of the class was exactly the same as it always was. But towards the end, how would you say this if you were an American? How would you say this if you were an Australian? Are there any differences? The teacher has already done the work, of course, and knows either that there are or that they're not. But bringing in just a little bit every now and again, and it builds up then over time. And that seems to be the best way of doing it, as far as I can observe.
Let me address a different question. This one deals with standardized testing. And why is teaching pronunciation important in the class, or why is it important to test pronunciation as part of an international standard test? And the second part of this essentially goes to what is going to happen with the TOEFL and IELTS test, the standardized test?
Well, the second question, I have no idea, because this is not my world. I don't know what goes on in the testing world, particularly, again, just sporadically by encountering it in my occasional talks with teachers. No, I'm not a testing person. I don't know what's going on in the IELTS world. I just sit back and watch with amazement some of the developments there. But the first question is, part of the question is more interesting. The linguist's answer to this is to draw attention, once again, to the two main forces that drive language. One is the need for intelligibility. The other is the need for identity. These two forces drive language. Everything we do. I need to be intelligible to you, but not at the expense of losing my identity. I want to be me, as well as being understood by you. Now, we are all in this position. All of us need to retain that balance when we're talking to other people of being ourselves, true to ourselves, and yet at the same time, being intelligible to the person we're talking to. Otherwise, there will be no rapport at all. Now, the question is, why? Why is accent so important? And the answer is this. It is the biggest way of expressing identity that we have. Imagine, if I say to you, I'm from Wales, I have already told you that. If I wanted to show you my Welsh identity, how might I do it? I could dress in a very Welsh way. I could have a badge, which I have here, saying, I am from Wales. And this would show my identity to you all. But there are problems with clothes and badges. You cannot see them in the dark. You cannot see them around a corner. They're useless. There is only one thing that you can perceive in the dark and around corners, and that is the voice, and that is your accent. So that is why accent is so important as a marker of identity. It is the easiest thing to express identity. It's always there. And it doesn't cost anything. You have to buy your clothes and buy your badge, but you don't have to buy your accent. And so accent is the most important marker of identity that we have. And that is why it is important to keep it in the forefront of our teaching. And that is why it is always so important in a testing scenario. However, in a testing scenario, the change has been slow in my experience. Testers test intelligibility. They don't take into account traditionally identity. But this is slowly changing. In the testing situations I know, there is now a much greater tolerance of accent variation than there was a generation ago. I remember talking to a lot of people at the British Council, for instance, who do testing of this kind. Once upon a time, the only accent that would be considered acceptable in a test situation was received pronunciation. Today, the testers are much more accepting of regional variation in accent, as long as the accent remains intelligible. I mean, once upon a time, if I had been tested, I would have failed because my regional accent would not have been acceptable. In the 19th century, definitely I would have failed. But these days, no, there is a greater tolerance in terms of perception, comprehension, that side of things. In terms of production, then indeed, you need to have an accent that you're comfortable with, that you have learned well, that is consistent. That's important. So whatever the accent is, whether it's received pronunciation or general American or whatever it is, then there is a certain level of intelligibility that one achieves, a certain level of consistency that one achieves, and that is what these tests are aiming to establish.
Professor, do you see that you started writing about internet language actually about 10, 12 years ago. And obviously, as you mentioned, it's radically changed even within that period of time. Do you see what was very informal conversation or a style of communication moving into more of a formal situations?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Very interesting. What seems to have happened is that the demographic of the internet has widened in all internet domains. And as a result, greater stylistic variation is now being encountered than before. In the beginning, remember, and the beginning is not that long ago, we're only talking about the early 1990s, the geeks in California who invented all these things, they thought the internet is the coolest thing on earth. It's a free world, we can break all the rules, and we can talk informally, leave out punctuation. This is going to be wonderful. You know, it was that kind of atmosphere around in the 1990s. So it was a young people's medium. And then gradually the demographic grew. And now old people use the internet all the time. And with that comes the conservatism that one would expect from an older generation. So I am rather different, I suppose, because as you say, I've been studying and writing on the internet ever since the 1990s. And so my intuition is perhaps more diverse and tolerant compared with most people's. But let me look at the messages I get. These days, I will get emails that look like a traditional letter. They begin, "Dear Professor Crystal," or "Dear David," and they will end, "Yours faithfully," or "Yours sincerely," and so on. And at the same time, I will get emails which say, "Hi, Dave," and end with "Cheers," or something. All sorts. And it is that increased diversity that I have seen. So I wouldn't want to say that the internet has become more formal as a statistical thing, because I don't know the answer to that. Who can count all the internet after all? But I would say that there has been evidence, clear evidence of increasing diversity. But it's all too soon to generalize and to reach a firm conclusion. After all, remember, the internet has only been around for 30 years for most of us. I know it was around a bit before that, but let me ask you all the question out there. When did you first send an email? For some of you, all your life, if you're young. For those of you who are older, not until the mid-1990s or even later. When did you first do a Google search? You couldn't have done that until 1999. When did you first go on Facebook? You couldn't have done that until 2004. YouTube, 2005. Twitter, 2006. Instagram, and so on. You see what I'm saying? All of this is in the last 10, 20 years. So it's too soon to be certain just how long these novel features and these changes in the internet are going to last. I remember talking to one of the conservative people, the more formal people you mentioned a little while ago, and because he's a friend, in a jocular way, I said, hey, look, you don't use emails like letters. He said, oh, don't I? I said, no, be cool, be modern, be with it. And they said, oh, okay. So the next time I got a message from him, it wasn't like a letter. Now, that's just me and him chatting. But is there a mood out there where older conservative users are noticing the younger trends and saying, hey, I could be like that, I could be young again, and then dropping their formality? Too soon to say, but it's certainly a feature of internet development at the moment, indeed.
We have another one from the chat box. With the advancement of artificial intelligence, do you think that AI and humans can coexist in the English language industry, especially in countries with English as a second language?
Wow, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? And again, it's too soon to say, but the kind of manifestation of AI on the internet at the moment still shows an enormous gap between what you and I do as human beings interacting with each other and the sort of thing that the machines do when they interact with each other. I know it's certainly possible to do one of those tests where you show somebody a conversation and say, was it produced by a machine or was it produced by a human? And there are occasions when you can't tell the difference. But when you actually look at informal conversation, no AI device at the moment is remotely capable of matching, simulating the kind of what? The two things that characterize an informal conversation. First of all these manifestations of thinking process. I say to you, so you see, mind you, to be honest, to be perfectly frank, as a matter of fact, and all of these things, no machine does anything like that. And then the other big difference is that we play with our language. You remember a little while ago, I said there are two big forces driving language, intelligibility and identity. Well, there is a third force, and that is the need to play, language playfulness. We mess about with our language. We joke with it. We put on silly voices. We play with words. That's what Shakespeare taught us to do, how to play with words. No machine likes to do that at the moment. And I'm not quite sure that it would have the mental capacity to do it anyway, eventually. So I think there's still quite a big gap between what's manifesting on AI at the moment and in the foreseeable future and the realities of everyday conversation. So, you know, AI will help us enormously. I use AI functionality every now and again, Google Translate and things like this. But that's a good example. If you look at Google Translate and see the difference between the sentence that you've put in with its colloquialisms and the sentence that you get back. And if you back translate it, usually all the colloquialisms have disappeared.
All right, and I still encouraging people to send in questions. And by the way, Professor, I know you don't check the chat box. I just want to convey to you that they many accolades.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. So you are all listening out there.
Yeah,
you are all alive.
You know, this is a collective group, sort of nodding our heads and smiling. Right. Here's a question: what tools in the linguist toolkit would you suggest we bring into our classroom?
What in the linguist toolkit? You mean?
What tools in the linguist toolkit would we suggest?
Oh, would you bring it? Yeah.
Yeah. Would you suggest we bring into the classroom?
Well, ideally, all of it, but in the background. In the background. I mean, you already do bring in a lot of the linguist's toolkit into the classroom. You will have grammatical terms for parts of speech, words like noun and adjective and verb, I suppose. You will have words like sentence and maybe words like clause even, and so on. The big change in English language teaching in the last 50 years, of course, has been a change where this terminology was essential and in the forefront to a more communicative kind of teaching where that terminology is in the background and sometimes actually never used at all. That is going too far. That is throwing, you know, the idiom, the baby out with the bathwater, getting rid of all terminology. No, some terminology is essential. Why? Because it saves time. If we don't have words like noun and adjective, it's very difficult to succinctly express a point of word order or a point of structure in a sentence. Similarly with pronunciation. In an ideal world, everybody would know the International Phonetic Alphabet. And that's the tool that I think would be immensely useful in all classrooms. But I recognize that that's not possible for many. Their ears are not up to it. The amount of time it would take to learn it, to learn the whole thing, is just not practicable. But the occasional phonetic symbol can help to distinguish two accents, for instance. A difference between, say, a British accent and an American accent might be pinpointed by saying, look, this is the symbol we use for the sound in British English. This is the symbol for American English. Listen to the difference and remember the symbols. That can help an awful lot. I think that's especially important when you get onto things like teaching intonation and rhythm and tone of voice and things like that, where a bit of visual presentation can make all the difference. A bit like a musical scale helps us understand music. I mean, that's a good analogy, isn't it? Do I need the composer's toolkit to understand music? No, I can sit back and enjoy a piece of music without any of that toolkit. But if I do know a little bit about music and I know about scales and keys and can read a little bit of music, then it helps me understand a great deal more of what's going on. So within limitations, I would say, yes, the linguist's toolkit is useful, but don't think of it just as the minutiae of linguistic terminology of grammar. Think of all the linguistic terms I've used to you today in my talk. Terms like dialect, accent, variety. These are part of the toolkit and they can be brought into the classroom very easily. And I'm quite sure that you do a lot of that already.
Well, here's a fun question. Do you have a personal antidote of a language change wrought by the widespread use of the internet and related technologies that you found surprising or beyond what you could have predicted?
Oh, all the time. Yes, absolutely. And you know, in the last 2 years, that's when I've been most bowled over by the amount of language play on the internet in relation to COVID or COVID, depending upon your accent. When COVID came along, I was expecting new terminology, such as, social distancing and all that sort of thing, quarantine. What I was not expecting was to see on the internet, especially, a huge proliferation of playful changes in the terminology of COVID. So take quarantine, for instance. Soon we found quarantinagers. That is, teenagers who are being kept at home because of quarantine. Horrible phenomenon it must have been, a quarantinager. Oh. At the end of the day, you might have wanted a quarantini, a martini. Or you might be quarantitotal, not have any quarantine drinks at all. Or you might have had quarantine time, and so on, and so on, and so on. And I started to collect these and gave up after a while because there were so many. So every time we encounter a new social phenomenon, then we're likely to encounter fun. Yes, you call it a fun question, and it is, because so many of the surprises that come from using language, either on the internet or in literature. Don't forget literature here. We haven't talked about that much today, except indirectly with Shakespeare. Don't forget that literature is the place, online or offline, where these surprises are always coming at us. Poets, novelists, dramatists, using language in an original and powerful way, which bowl you over because of the new vocabulary, the new grammar, whatever it is that they're doing. And so that's the area perhaps where I find myself most surprised, I think.
Well, we're cutting close to the end of our time, so I'll ask for one last question. Is there one last question or comment? Or oh, what is your next new book about?
Thank you. Which is my next new book? Well, I'm always writing. This is what I do. I don't do so much traveling these days, partly because of age, partly because of COVID and all the rest of it. So I spend quite a lot of time writing at home. The next new book is actually going to be a Shakespeare book written with my son, Ben. Ben Crystal is an actor, a director, theater guy generally. You may have come across his stuff online. Actors, as you know, in the world often don't work because there is no work, especially in COVID. Oh, I mean, the poor theatrical profession, all the actors in the world who were suddenly completely out of work, and Ben was one of them. So he started to do some more writing. He's already done a very well acclaimed book called Shakespeare on Toast. And so he and I got together and thought, what can we do? And we decided to put together a new book. It's going to be called Everyday Shakespeare. And what it is we've been through all the plays and all the poems and pulled out the lesser known observations of Shakespeare. Not the famous quotations, not to be or not to be, not those, but the everyday quotations that can actually help us understand our situation as human beings in the world, thanks to Shakespeare. And so we spent the last few months collecting these. We're just in the final process now of putting these together. The book will be out early next year, the folio anniversary year, called Everyday Shakespeare, published by Chambers. And that's going to be our next one. And it's been very enjoyable. Apart from the encounter with Shakespeare, it's always great fun working with your kid, you know, working with your son, because you suddenly learn that your generation of understanding is different from his. Now, I've got time to give you just one example. When we were putting together our Shakespeare website, Ben and I, it's called shakespeareswords.com. And we were looking at all the difficult words in Shakespeare. And I was saying, we must put in all the difficult words. And we came across the word Goth, G-O-T-H, Goth. The Goths. I said, we don't need to put that word in. Everybody knows who the Goths were, if they know any history. The people who came from Europe and went down into Italy and destroyed Rome, the Goths and the Vandals, everybody knows that. And Ben said to me, yes, Goths, they're people who wear black eye makeup and strange hair. And I suddenly realized, oh yes, Goths have a totally different meaning now. So anybody reading about the Goths in Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare's play, might have assumed that Shakespeare was talking about people with black eye makeup and cool modern behavior. So in the end, of course, we put the meaning of the word Goths in. That's what I mean by saying there's a generation gap in the study of Shakespeare, but there is a generation gap in the study of everything. And time for just one more example, perhaps. This may surprise you, but not everybody. I was writing a little book a few years ago called A Little Book of Language. A Little Book of Language. It was aimed at 12-year-olds, young teenagers. So I tried to write about language in a way that a 12-year-old would understand. And then I thought, I'd better get it read by a 12-year-old before it is published to make sure I've got it right. So I got a tame 12-year-old and paid her to read the book and go through and underline every word that she didn't understand. And for the most part, it seems I got it right. But when we got to the chapter on pseudonyms, now a pseudonym is a false name, and many film stars, television stars, use false names, not the name they were born with. And when I got to that chapter, as one of the examples of a pseudonym, I used John Wayne. John Wayne. She underlines John Wayne. And I say to her, don't you know who John Wayne is? She says, I've never heard of him. Well, all you out there, do you know who John Wayne is? And it seems that if you're over a certain age, you know he's one of the greatest Hollywood cowboys there have ever been. And if you're under a certain age, you've no idea. So the generation gap is always there. And those of you who are teachers of young people know this better than anybody. I've had to learn it the hard way, but working with Ben has been one way of doing it.